back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy at my friend Charles.
I'm ready to have fantasy be talked to me, Dylan, because today we are back for the second time this week to continue our Friends Pitching Fantasy series. It has returned, and today is a special day because today Dylan is going to be pitching his fantasy books for us to read next on the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast.
It's a Dylan episode. I know. Everyone's
Dylan
excited
episode.
About that.
Yeah.
Yeah, a very Dylan episode of Friends Talking Fantasy. But the focus isn't going to be on me today, Charles. The focus is going to be on three amazing book/series that I'll be pitching to you, not necessarily just at you, Charles.
Appreciate that.
For this, this episode of Friends Pitching Fantasy, where we're following up. You already did your Friends Pitching Fantasy episode. I still have to figure out which of the three books you pitched that I'm going to select. I still have no idea. To give them a peek behind the curtain, we're recording this right after. So it hasn't been 2 days. I'm equally flummoxed, as I said.
Right.
But I have three book/series, Charles, that I'm going to pitch to you. And I am really excited to see which of them you are going to pick to be among our next two reads on Friends Talking Fantasy.
I know, and you usually bring the heavy hitters. It's been a while since we've done FPF, but you've always tortured me by bringing a bunch of heavy hitters at the same time for me to try and choose from. It's like choosing between children sometimes. It's like, why are you making me choose? It's not fair. But that's the spirit of the series. A few quick housekeeping things. Yes, our last episode before this one was my pitches. You can listen to this one first, then go back and listen to that if you want. You can listen to them in either order. Dylan's going to pick one of my books from the last episode. I'm going to pick one of Dylan's books from this episode. We're going to read both on the show, but we're going to take a few days to decide over on social media, mostly over on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end, but we'll be all over the place. And really need your input, guys, on how to decide between these books. I don't know what Dylan's going to bring to the table. I know he was kind of swapping out ideas the other day when we were kind of comparing notes, so I'll be curious to see what he brings to the table. And that's what we're gonna have. Three pitches, but only one will be read imminently on the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. So Dylan, why don't you take it away and tell us what books you've brought to the pitching floor today?
Oh yeah, Charles, I brought it because I rarely have any notes or anything. I brought it this time. I've got my glasses on now. I didn't have them when I was receiving the pitch. So I'm feeling studious. I've got all sorts of notes for my pitches on these three awesome book/series.
Ooh.
And it's hard. I can't just say books. But we're starting off with... this is brutal on the video because I have a virtual background, so you can't see unless I'm right in front of it. I'm starting off with The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. That's going to be the first book that I will pitch. That is a classic of modern fantasy, recent releases. Super excited about that one. Next up, I'll be talking about Fonda Lee's. Oh, yes, I did. Fonda Lee's Jade War, which is book 2. I'm pitching books 2 and 3 of the Greenbone Saga because we read book 1, Jade City, earlier this year. Technically late last year, but only a couple months ago, I think. So we know we loved that one. And I want to read the rest of the series ASAP.
Oh, yeah.
But you'll have a tough decision because you'll also be deciding through a total classic standalone by Guy Gavriel Kay. That's Tigana. I mean, Charles, this is going to be a real Sophie's choice for you.
You did, as you always do. You're making me choose between Evan Winter's Fonda Lee and Guy Gavriel Kay. What? So, I'm excited for your first pitch because of all your pitches, this is the only book I have not read. So I'm super eager to hear what you have to say.
Well, the only book you haven't read anything from the series. You have not read
that's true.
Jade War.
The only author I have not read, I think I said, right? So maybe,
yes.
I don't remember. But yes, that's true. I have not read the rest of the Greenbone Saga either, so I have not read Jade War.
Okay. Well, should I just get into the Rage of Dragons, Charles?
Let's hear it. I'm excited.
Okay. So, Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. It's his debut novel. It's the first in the Burning trilogy, of which 2 books are out right now. It was originally published, self-published in 2017, but after absolutely massive fanfare, it was picked up by Orbit and re-released in 2019 as a traditionally published book. It is a really interesting book that I should probably get into the premise just a little bit. This is the blurb. The Omehi people have been fighting an unwinnable fight for almost 200 years, and the lucky ones are born gifted. 1 in every 2,000 women has the power to call down dragons. 1 in every 100 men is able to magically transform himself into a bigger, stronger, faster killing machine. But the story follows Tao, a character who is born without these gifts, but has set his mind to becoming the greatest swordsman to ever live in pursuit of revenge, Charles. So, yeah. It takes place in, by the way, sitting at an impressive 4.32 on Goodreads right now. Wow. This has been extremely well received in all those ways. It takes place in an African-inspired setting, which we always talk about the idea of a breath of fresh air away from all these medieval European fantasy settings, and this one will definitely bring it. And we've always enjoyed when we've read African-inspired settings in fantasy. So it's been described, Charles, as Gladiator meets Game of Thrones. I mean, what more could we ever ask for than that? I mean, are you not entertained, Charles? So everything, you look entertained. Everything I've heard about this series has been just absolutely glowing. I'm sure you've felt the same. Part of what attracts me to it, and I think will attract you to it as well, is that I've heard that despite being this awesome, epic fantasy world, it is apparently an extremely intimate story. The book focuses on Tao and his arc as a character, this revenge story and how that affects him personally. And I've heard it does not pad the book with world building just for world building's sake. I hear the world is awesome. So by the way, I haven't read this if I didn't say that explicitly yet to the listeners, but I'm super excited about the idea of getting into it. So yeah, drawing from what I've heard, awesome world, but he uses that style of world building that you and I absolutely love, where it is more about service to the character, to the plot, to the themes, and the world gets built around that. So love those intimate stories. The consensus regarding the characters, fully formed, tons of depth. That protagonist, Tao, he's among many people's favorite characters, hard stop. And people talk about how the motivations are really strong for all the characters, including the antagonists. You know, we did like favorite villains episodes, or one episode of that in the past, and always love when the antagonist is someone that you can understand where they're coming from, even if you don't agree with it. And it sounds like this book has those strong villains in it. Also really pumped about what I've heard about the pacing of the story, Charles. So, ready for this? You know Daniel Green, of course, booktuber extraordinaire.
Oh, yeah.
So he stated that it has arguably the best pacing for any fantasy story he has read.
Wow.
Right? That's
For an
pretty
epic
good.
fantasy, that's
But
huge.
yeah. And so that brings up some like Poppy War by R.F. Kuang vibes for me. It's something that we were praising a lot when it came to that book was it just keeps moving. And I hear this is like a pretty straight line telling of Tao's story. And I that's something that more and more I've come to appreciate as I've gone further into my fantasy reading. So anyway, we heard that from Green. And that is just a drop in the bucket of the high praise that he provided. He went on to say, this was in 2019, that The Rage of Dragons was the best debut fantasy novel he has come across.
Wow.
That, right. And that's echoed by our buddy David S. over at FanFi Addict, one of our friends we're interacting with all the time on social media. He called it quite possibly the best debut novel he has ever read.
Wow.
Unsurprisingly, it was also the winner of the Reddit, like the R Fantasy subreddit, award for best debut fantasy novel. And that's
that
where
the
this
Stabbies?
really picked up a lot of steam. It probably was. I mean, this is how they phrased it wherever I was looking, but it makes sense that it'd be the
We just didn't want to say
Stabbies.
Stabbies.
So it sounds more official if I'm like the winner of our Fantasy's award for best debut fantasy novel. And that's where it picked up a lot of steam. Like people were just going absolutely crazy for this book on Reddit. And that helped it get picked up traditionally published. But it's not just Reddit that has had such high praise. There's this little magazine called Time Magazine. Maybe you've heard of it, Charles.
I have.
That created, yes. They created this top 100 fantasy books of all time. Top 100 all time, Charles. And this relatively recent book found its way onto that list as well. So overall, when you think about all this, I felt like The Rage of Dragons and Evan Winter's work in general, it's just one of the largest holes in our reading history when it comes to this idea of these like modern fantasy classics, these hit releases of the last 5 years. And I always hear people whenever they pick this up, they're like, how did I not pick this up earlier? And they're mad at themselves for even just reading all these different books recently that they might not have enjoyed as much. So, Charles, I ask you, why have we not picked this up earlier? And I request of you that it is time we correct this issue. It is time that we read The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter on Friends Talking Fantasy.
Oh, man, that is a fantastic pitch, by the way. Fantastic selection, too. Your conclusion kind of summarizes my reason behind really wanting to pick this. It's this idea that Evan Winter is such a gap in our reading vocabulary. Like, I see his presence in the bookish community, and it's so positive and so prevalent. And then I see just the amount of praise of his work, both like Breakthrough and Time Magazine and Reddit and all of that, and also like amongst many of our favorite authors and then amongst our peers as well. It's one of those things that it's like, why haven't we gone into this? And then you talk about that winning formula of like epic fantasy told in a way that keeps itself like contained within the characterization of the story, because that to me is such a I know a lot of people go towards epic fantasy for this reason of like, I want to know this whole sprawling continent and where the militaries are moving around and all the politics. And for me, sometimes it gets a little too big, a little too overwhelming. I tend to gravitate towards stories exactly like this. And I see Sebastian de Castell, by the way. I'm like perusing Goodreads and it says, a I've been generally trying to get away from books about great wars and warriors, lofty magic, and military organizations being the center of the story. Yet Winter's debut kept me captivated precisely because he managed to do what many of those books seem to avoid. He kept the story incredibly contained within the life of its main character. And it's like, that is exactly what I'm like, bolsters my confidence when I see like epic fantasy of an ongoing unfinished series, right? Which this is book one of like a currently ongoing unfinished series, right?
Yes. So 2 of the 3 books have come out. I don't think we have a release date for the final book, but just pitching the first one, and seems like people loved it as a standalone story as well. Of course, I'm sure there's a lot to get into in the following books. I know a lot of people are anxiously awaiting that 3rd book, but yeah, this is the first of 3.
Got it. I wonder, like, do you know anything about, there's one other book out in this, right? Do you know anything about like how the series kind of,
The Fires of Vengeance, right?
does it keep
I
with
mean,
the
I've heard
same
fantastic.
character, or does it like
I believe
change?
it does.
Okay, interesting. But
Yeah, I don't know for sure, but I believe it does. And I've tried to, I always try to avoid looking at stuff with the second book when,
but it is like
for spoiler reasons.
well-received
But
and-
Charles, very well received, very well received. So much so, Charles, that I almost never do this. I own a copy of book 2 already. Not just do I own a copy of book 1, I own a copy of book 2. That's how confident I am that I'm going to love these books. I'm pretty confident you're going to love them too, Charles.
Well said. And like you asked me about settings in my books. The setting in this one, you said it was like expired from like African cultures. Like, is that correct? I see some people like invoking like the Zulu and things like that. That's also an interesting kind of spin on what we've read from, like, I'm getting like Game of Thrones vibes a little bit from all of this. I see Shadow of the Gods as in the recommended, and I see Kings of the Wild as in the recommended, which is interesting. I think because it's got that same Reddit like kickoff kind of origin story. I see Jade City in there as well, which I'd be curious about. The connection there, but no, I mean, like, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think you said Game of Thrones, that idea of this gladiator meets Game of Thrones. It sounds like it's like you're placing someone in a Game of Thrones level of epic world and epic stakes and all that kind of stuff, but you're telling more of that intimate, like Gladiator, the movie, Russell Crowe, a vehicle that has this individual character that has their main motivation. Revenge is that easy one to get behind, and obviously that's a huge thing in Gladiator. And I think it has that level of, as we've said, intimacy within the larger Game of Thrones world. And I really do think, even though I don't see this one coming up, it gives me the vibes of a Poppy War, in the sense that we get this really incredible depth of one particular character, Rin in the case of the Poppy War, and just cruise through their story without the barriers of like, oh, let's go get this side character's like story as well. It's like, no, this is Tao's story, and we came away from the Poppy War. Right, yes, Brienne of Tarth looking for Sansa, who has not been anywhere near where Brienne of Tarth is looking for like 2 books, but in this one, it sounds like we won't have to deal with that aspect of Game of Thrones. We get to deal with cool aspects of Game of Thrones, for lack of a better way of putting it. But yeah, we came away, I remember, from Poppy War thinking like, okay, these are this is one of our favorite characters ever in Rin, because you get to really sit with that character, and I think that's what we're going to get with Tao. But don't worry, there's dragons, and there's basically superpowers, and everything. It sounds like a character who has some aspects of the underdog as well, which is always fun. And I hear incredible things, Charles, about the way that battles are written in this book, like shades of John Gwynne in that sense.
Oh, I mean, look, I don't have too many questions here. This book has been on my short list for a long time. Evan Winter's been an author that I've been like very eager to get into. So this is an easy sell for me. The only problem is there's two other books here that I really want to read as well that are in the mix. So I think I'd be curious to see like kind of if you can convince me not to pick Evan Winter at this point. Like I'm so eager, but man, I don't know. You're bringing up two other real heavy hitters. Yeah, I think you may as well just get into the next one.
Gladly, Charles. So the next one, that's going to be Jade War and Jade Legacy by Fonda Lee. That's books 2 and 3 of the Greenbone saga. So I'm not going to read a synopsis of this one because we're starting at that second book. Don't want to spoil anything for our listeners about what may have happened in the first one. But just to convey to listeners, the Greenbone saga mainly follows the story of a crime syndicate family as they battle for supremacy on the island of Kaikon. Urban fantasy setting in terms of its technology level. It's Asian inspired, and people always compare this series to like The Godfather of fantasy. So The Godfather being the movie, not the role in a family. But we recently read Jade City, which was the World Fantasy Award-winning first novel in the Greenbone saga. So I feel I'm starting from a good place with you here, Charles, where we both love that one. We love Fonda's writing. And I want to say, I know it's fun to start a new series. I know that's something that's going to be appealing about books like The Rage of Dragons. And a lot of times we do enjoy hopping around and do a lot of these book ones before we get back to any given series. But this series is different, Charles. And I think you know that because we have every reason to believe that this series is one where you have to keep going with it pretty as soon as possible, because in a way, unlike any series we've ever covered, every single time that we've talked about the first book in this series on social media or anything else, we just get flooded by people telling us how important it is to read the whole series ASAP.
That we have.
I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon that it's just hard to explain. It's like we've read series like or at least the first in the Broken Earth trilogy, let's say, which is a series that literally won the Hugo with like each of its installments in the trilogy. And even that one, it's like we read the 5th season and everyone was excited, but we don't get hit by the same wave of like, okay, now you have to read all of them. For whatever reason, this series, everyone is saying, hey, if you're going to read the first one, you gotta just keep rolling right away. And we just never seen that before at that level. I know you know that, Charles. And so I'm trying to figure out, okay, what's going on here? I took a look at the Goodreads ratings for the entire Greenbone saga. So catch this, Charles. Jade City, book 1, 4.11. Obviously a great rating, and I think not surprising to us.
How many number of ratings?
But then we jump into Jade. Okay,
I can pull it up. Keep going.
Charles, you give that a look while I keep going. Yeah, but I'm sure a lot, right? This is a very popular series.
38,000. 38,000.
Yeah, I think that's enough to feel confident that we're getting a nice sample there. Jade War, book 2, we're jumping up to 4.45, right? So that's a 0.34 increase, and we're starting to get like closer to that 5. Jade Legacy, book 3, Charles, 4.67. You just don't see that, right?
I mean, rare.
Literally rounds to 5, right? So that indicates to me, not just is this a series that keeps up the momentum of that first book, it's a huge improvement with each book. I mean, you rarely see that. I'm usually I usually enjoy the first book in a series more than the later ones, but this seems like it's really the exception. So we're only going up, I think, from a book that we loved. And it's just interesting to see how much an author grows when they're doing that, right? So I want to see how Fonda grows as an author because she's at such an amazing starting place. Where does she go from there to even further improve? So, Charles, Fonda Lee does an incredible job of exploring these themes of family and honor, which are common themes, but she comes at it from such a unique angle. And I think there's just so much more for us to see in future books now that we have these characters established. Like, we don't really need to know at the same level, like, who are they? We get to really dive into their relationships with each other, as well as some exciting plot points. That book one ended with some loose threads. I know I won't get into details, but I know one of the aspects of the conclusion we both really enjoyed regarding like how a relationship changed between two characters. And I really want to see where that goes.
Oh, yeah.
And I also, and of course, Fonda has this incredible hard magic system centered around the idea of jade, this sort of drug that you take, which has all sorts of repercussions and limitations to it, which we always say that, as Brandon Sanderson says in one of his rules of magic systems, the limitations and the weaknesses are always more interesting in a magic system than are the strengths. And I think that one of Fonda's strengths is utilizing those weaknesses to like put her characters in these interesting tumultuous situations. So I think there are only further secrets to uncover with that incredible magic system. But in all, everything we've heard about this series, I really go back to this idea that it has to be a must read because of all these people can't be wrong who jump on the bandwagon of you got to read the whole series as soon as possible. And I really do think the sooner we do that, the better, because we don't want to forget anything. I hear there's time skips and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's time skips.
Right, we want to jump into that before we have a time skip ourselves between the books. So really important to keep going ASAP, Charles. And in this in this pitch, I request that you allow us to.
That's well said, Dylan. And I think, this was another one that was like a Twitter darling, recommended to us like crazy. I see a lot of other shows picking this series up, and for good reason. The thing that interests me, it's like you said, it's one of those weird things where people insist on books 2 and 3, like the whole series. Like, don't stop on one, don't judge it on just one alone. Do the whole thing. And what's interesting is book 1 is not bad, it's very good. And the fact that they're telling you to not form opinions just on one, even though it's already like a really strong debut novel, is super bizarre. Usually you'd say that if you were like a little insecure about book 1 and you want someone to, like, the ending's really good. You're like, oh, the ending's really good, just read the whole thing. And then, or like a TV show, it's like, you gotta get to the end, it really picks up. It's not like that at all. It's like starts strong and people say, but wait, keep going. And if I had to hazard a guess, I would say it's Fonda Lee's strength of like plotting and narrative arcs. Like, people say it's Godfather-esque, the first book, and I definitely, like, it made me want to watch The Godfather, and I went back and watched all the movies, and it was like so much fun putting me in that space. But what she's able to do is take those kind of like that genre and take all of the like ingredients from that and all the tropes from it and like combine it together to make a really interesting story. Honestly, the way it's told gives me also like Star Wars vibes, and what makes Star Wars so good. It's like you can take the characters and you can interweave them throughout an arcing story, and you can have like different alliances, partnerships, like good people turning bad, bad people turning good. Like, you can hit all those tropes, like Star Wars hits like the space opera tropes, and then this hits like the fantasy version of just like, it's so much fun to see how these characters weave in and out of the story and to see where the story goes. So I get a lot of that kind of energy from this, and obviously I love The Godfather and a good organized crime story, and this is such a different perspective and voice to that I like really enjoyed the first one. And so I'm looking forward to seeing, like, it only makes sense, right, that like someone whose primary strengths are in like this kind of exposition story arc narrative kind of driven story, that to see where it continues to go only improves on that, right? It's like she's writing a 3-part story, so you're only getting the first piece, and although it's a complete story and everything, it's like, you know, a very good contained story that obviously goes into a trilogy. Unlike other trilogies, it's just like, I don't know, for whatever reason, it's like the first cannot be judged without the end. And so I'm super excited to see where it goes. And I think if we were to turn this to Twitter, my money would be on them choosing this amongst the three. Yeah. Although I think Evan Winter would give
although Rage of Dragons.
Yeah, I think Evan Winter would be tough competition. I still think Fonda Lee's gonna win out, at least from what I've seen people
on
talking
Twitter.
About today. Like I think like this Greenbone saga is still a very prominent topic of discussion for a lot of people in our sphere. So yeah, super excited. Not too many questions, obviously. It's a tough choice. I do want to finish reading it, and I do want to see where it goes. And I want to see what all this, like, read the whole thing is about. You know, like, I feel like I'm missing that piece to the Fonda Lee Greenbone saga experience. So it is definitely something that we've already started, right? So it seems natural to finish while it's fresh, you know?
Yeah, I'll just add that this is offering a full conclusion in a way that the Rage of Dragons won't be able to provide of the whole series, because even if we were to keep rolling, we'd be stuck at the Fires of Vengeance until book 3 comes out. So I think the Rage of Dragons, that's why I pitched only the first book right now, because it sounds like it does stand alone extremely well in its own way. But reading Jade War, reading Jade Legacy, we get that complete story where the author gets to tell everything she has to say in this with these characters in this story. So I think that is something very much worth considering. Yeah, I have to say I'm also interested, Charles, by this idea you were talking about with, I always think of with that, like, oh, you gotta read the whole thing, you gotta keep going, like you said. It is what you expect when the first book is just not great. So you can only imagine when the first book is great, how much better it gets. I always think of like Malazan. I know it's not pronounced that. It's like Malazan or something is how you're supposed to pronounce it, right. Malazan or something. But I would say Malazan, it's like book 1 of that. It's like you're probably not even going to understand what's happening or anything like that. And it's super dense and all that. But just keep going. It's like even the fans are acknowledging, like, okay, this isn't great, but you got to keep going. Right. Like you said, Charles, this one, the first book is great. So
and they say
why not keep going?
Yeah, exactly. Well said.
Yeah.
But speaking of great stories, you've got another one in the chamber here that I'm very familiar with.
You are very familiar with this one, Charles. You read it before I read it. I think I read it on your recommendation. It is Tigana by Guy Gavriel Kay. And if anything, Charles, you've usually been the one pushing this over me. And this is a return, Charles. I did pitch this already, I believe, in 2021. Can you believe that, Charles? In 2023, we're doing FPF in 2021. I guess we started this podcast in 2020.
We sure did.
Oh my God. FTF, FTF's like becoming a toddler. So
grows up so fast.
I know, doesn't it? But Tigana, I'll give the brief synopsis here of this standalone book. It's the blurb is the magical story of a beleaguered land struggling to be free. It is the tale of a people so cursed by the black sorcery of a cruel, despotic king that even the name of their once beautiful homeland cannot be spoken or remembered. But years after the devastation, a handful of courageous men and women embark upon a dangerous crusade to overthrow their conquerors and bring back to the dark world the brilliance of a long-lost name, Tigana. That kind of sets the tone. That's a really good, well-written blurb, right?
So well
Sounds like you really get that, but it does convey that kind of almost poetic, epic storytelling of this beautifully written standalone by an author that many consider the master of the standalone in Guy Gavriel Kay. I know we've called him that at times all over the internet. I don't have to list them all. You know this, Charles. You're going to find these lists and these rankings that oftentimes place it as the best fantasy standalone of all time. That's not uncommon for you to see if you're going to do some Googling about this book. I think that's why you picked it up, Charles, because it was so consistently ranked among the best ever. So we both read this one and enjoyed it. I know I'm preaching to the choir with the positive things I'll say about it, but I gotta remind you, Charles, because it's been quite a few years for each of us since we read it. And with a book that has as much depth as this one, we're going to garner a lot of value from checking out again after so much time, after so much additional reading within the fantasy genre, because this inspired a lot of folks. Guy Gavriel Kay's writing. I mean, we talked about Nicholas Eames, who's a very different writer in his own way, but he said when he first started out, he was basically trying to write like Guy Gavriel Kay. And this is a book published in 1990, which is like hard to believe. It was so ahead of its time in so many ways, right? It's got this critical exploration of colonialism and imperialism that feels very modern, right? The complexity of the characters goes as well way beyond, like, right? Because they have this depth and this almost moral grayness, a lot of them, which you weren't seeing as much at that time. And it just goes way beyond what we'd expect for like 30 plus years ago.
Right.
And I think when we first read it, Charles, we weren't really in the place to appreciate that at the level that we would now, right? Because we've read so much since that it's like, wow, this was a hugely seminal and influential work. And I think we can appreciate on that level beyond just appreciating the story in itself. I don't know if we quite did that when we first read it. There are some aspects of the book and the authorial choices that are very discrepant from what you'd expect to find in traditionally published fantasy novels. And I think that our additional time and all these additional books will enable us to have this fresh perspective on both the ways that Tigana was ahead of its time, and then these aspects that didn't age as well, maybe. I think all of that is great fodder for conversation in an FTF episode. I hope that we could provide a lot of insight into that for our listeners, and really, I'm just interested in having those conversations with you as well, Charles, placing it. We always talk about this idea of like a family tree for the fantasy genre, right? You're putting Lord of the Rings probably way at the top as the grandfather, unless you're going like way back to things like Gilgamesh or something. But, I think that Tigana has a very distinct place in that. And I just think we are better equipped to have a conversation about exactly where. So we also both know that it's incredible, getting a little bit more, not just into why it'd be fun to like talk about and explore it, but why it's such a great read in itself is how well Kay captures a setting. We talk about this all the time around Kay. He's able to just like convey this mood, this ambiance, and this tone that the reader feels so immersed in that setting. Like, I don't know if there's anyone who writes a setting as lovingly, I would say, as Guy Gavriel Kay does. You can tell he's doing so much research and he's just so passionate about it. And this is kind of that more Italian Renaissance era, Mediterranean feel. And it's just, you let that wash over you. It's an absolute joy to read that. We're also in this novel guaranteed to get this poetic prose that Kay manages to do, and it's like this epic storytelling prose while still staying grounded in characters, which is super hard to do. It's interesting military and political intrigue going on. It's got musicians as central characters, Charles. I know you as a musician yourself. We all know about your high school band, Nostalgia, who, just epic performances at the Coffee House Jam when we were younger in high school, Charles. Everyone remembers your performance of Sweet Emotion. Did I get the song right?
You did get it right.
Yeah, okay, I got it. I was saying the wrong Aerosmith song. But your performance, Sweet Emotion, and I know it appeals to the musician in you here, and it also will appeal to your sweet emotion, Charles, because this book will hit you right in the feels with some awesome twists. I know that the ending, especially the word I would use to describe it, is poignant. It is just such a stunning conclusion to the whole thing. And of course, that standalone aspect of it, that we do get that conclusion, it makes it such an appealing choice here to cover on the show. It doesn't make that huge commitment. And if afterwards we want to jump into the Rage of Dragons, or we want to jump into the rest of the Greenbone saga, we easily can do that, right? Just read this one book. And we talked about Guy Gavriel Kay's work so many times in our recommendation episodes. Feels like it's coming up all the time. And I think it's time that we give him the chance to take center stage as one of our actual buddy reads and give him a full episode dedicated to discussing it after we've read it. A full buddy read episode on Guy Gavriel Kay has not happened on FTF, Charles, and that's criminal. So, Charles, I think Tigana would be an excellent choice for our next read.
Well said, Dylan. It's an interesting pick. One I wasn't expecting, but I totally get and I totally see. Guy Gavriel Kay is one of my favorite authors that we haven't talked about on the show. And I think it's because he sits so uniquely in terms of like where in the genre he's coming from as a voice and as an author. He's also sitting in this place in 1990 that's like a really popular trend today of like creating a fantasy world that evokes unique histories, religions, folklore, customs, and bringing kind of this magical element into that. Like, it's not just European swords and sorcery or anything like that. Like, the idea of having a Mediterranean-inspired setting is something that Guy Gavriel Kay did a long time ago. And you see a lot of people pulling unique, typically underrepresented cultures and like settings for your fantasy novel, and I feel like Guy was kind of at the beginnings of that, and he's a master at it. He's always picking new settings in which to write his books. He's also a prolific standalone fantasy writer, which I feel is also kind of was a unique thing back in the day, and it still is kind of unique. So very interesting choice here, and there certainly is a lot to talk about. Like, it's been long enough now that I've forgotten all the intricate details of the story, but there's certainly a lot that I remember, and there's some really great ideas going on in here about like cultural identity and what it means to kind of fight for that, and how controlling history is a way to control a group of peoples. And so there's certainly a lot to talk about there. I remember certain characters too that were very kind of provocative. So yeah, I mean, I think we need to talk about Guy Gavriel Kay on the show a lot more. I think we need to pick up one of his books soon. I would love to read and talk about Tigana. I'm flipping through my copy right now, reminiscing about when I read it many years ago. This is an old edition, and who's on the cover?
It's a different copy than I have.
Anne McCaffrey is on here.
It looks older.
Well, it's a
than,
10th
like, my
anniversary
copy
edition, so it's
more-
probably from 2000.
Ah, gotcha.
So it's
Right.
old.
Yeah.
And it's a 10th
Oh,
anniversary.
that's an interesting. We gotta throw that on social media, Charles. I don't really see that. I don't think
This
I've ever
cover?
seen that cover before.
I don't know
Yeah,
how I wound
'cause
up
I have-
with it.
I have.
Yeah, that's
like,
the cover I
this
see
one,
a lot. Yeah.
Which that's the cover I see all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of cool seeing yours. And anyway, Charles, I want to go back and stress because I probably should have put this in my pitch, which is very based around like the time period that this was released and the
Yes.
place that it has in fantasy. Let me ground you in this. The first book of Wheel of Time came out in January of the same year as Tigana, which came out in August. So we're talking just months apart from a series that was still starting out like Tolkien clone-y, and that was like cutting edge fantasy at the time, was still like kind of Tolkien clone-esque. And also A Game of Thrones, that came out in 91. So Tigana predates Game of Thrones, like the first Game of Thrones book, which obviously like revolutionized the genre in so many ways, but it just doesn't read like the kind of stuff that was coming out there at all. And yeah, I really don't think I appreciate that this book is older than both of us. Not combined, but both of us
Not
individually.
combined, but it is but older than both.
Even
of us,
you,
for sure.
Charles. Even older than you. Yeah. It's weird to think because it literally does not read like that at all when you consider like, oh, this is like Wheel of Time's contemporary. Like first book.
And it's so different. Like Guy Gavriel Kay takes a very academic kind of scholarly approach, and you can tell he's someone that did a lot of like research, not just of the setting, but if there's like other cultural events that he's inspired by, he'll research those too. And it's just really interesting. Like I'm even like looking at the afterword here, and some of the inspiration came from like the Communist Party, like in the Iron Curtain and all of that.
God.
So it's like, wow, you're really
Right. That's what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
Like USSR stuff, right?
Exactly. And then here's it. Tigana is in good part a novel about memory, the necessity of it in cultural terms, and the dangers that come when it is too intense. Skeletto's decision at the end of the novel, which I won't get into, is a reflection of that, and so is the whatever passage that served as one of my epigraphs. The world today offers more than enough examples of both pitfalls, ignorance of history and its lessons, and the refusal to let the past be past. So that is interesting.
And isn't this idea, I gotta just briefly, but this idea of like colonialism and imperialism, like who was talking about that at this level in fantasy at that time, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting use of the fantasy genre that I feel like there were so many Tolkien clones and pulp novels throughout like the like late 80s and like into the 90s even, that like all of a sudden you have a guy taking an academic lens to different ideas in a more like using fantasy separate of, even though, you know, there's obviously like everyone was inspired by Tolkien, but it's like this idea of like, hey, we can tell a different story using different cultural backgrounds, and I can even approach this from this academic lens of like what's going on with communism and the Iron Curtain, and like I can go into all of that. And here's all the essays I've read about how all these things are related, and you're like, holy smokes, man, this is not what anyone else was doing. Like, yes, Tolkien was an academic and came from like language, but this guy's coming from like just really different perspectives to and using the fantasy genre in a totally different way. And that to me is always how Guy Gavriel Kay has stood out. And I think you see a lot of it now in modern fantasy, which is like all the books that I'm looking at on my shelf, like fifth season, Spear Cuts Through Water.
Yeah.
Like, so many of these
Poppy
books.
War
Poppy
and Babel,
War. Like,
Final Strife. It's like all of those real cutting edge books. It's like we were exploring a lot of those themes in Tigana 33 years ago.
Poppy War is a good one because there's a lot of research, academic
Yeah.
research going into like World War II that informed a lot of that book's like plot points and culture and history, and was really impactful in that story. And you kind of get a very kind of similar approach to fantasy writing here, although written in a totally different style and voice for sure. And this one kind of, it does feel its age a little bit, I remember, in characterizations and certain things that happen. But I think that only improves the discussion that we could have on it. So great pick. Don't need to harp on it any longer. So, like, so much that you picked 3 very different books.
Yeah.
And, like, that almost makes it harder because there's no, like, finding a way in which to pick one that's, like, that you can compare them to. They're so different. So, oh man, I don't know. They're great choices, though. We'll have to go.
Luckily, you don't have to know yet.
Well said. Thank goodness for that.
Yeah, and also, luckily, Charles, you can have some help in determining which of these series/books you are gonna pick, because we're going to have to reach out to social media, and you folks, we would absolutely love to hear from you about these. You can find us at the FTF Podcast 1 on Twitter. I'm sure I'll be tweeting about these, trying to just get some help for Charles. He was going to really need it. Maybe even you'll find Charles tweeting from his personal account is it at Charles_MC or something like that?
And I think another underscore after that, yeah. Look,
wait, what?
I don't know, man.
It's 2 underscores.
I think.
You don't know your own Twitter handle?
No, I'm not as plugged in as you. I know the FTF one, and that's what truly matters.
Okay. Well, you might even see Charles_M_C_.
No, I think it's Charles_MC_.
37.
No numbers.
You could have done better than that.
You'd be surprised.
But anyway, you might see Charles_MC_ tweeting about it, just actually venturing onto Twitter to get help. That's how desperate Charles might get. And you can also find us on Instagram at the FTF Podcast, and I'll be sure to pass along anything you folks are saying to try to help Charles make this, I think, extremely tough decision. I do think you have 3 right choices here, though, Charles.
I would agree. 3 right choices. Very excited to see what other people think, and I will definitely need their input to make an informed decision here. But the future of FTF looks bright. I mean, we've got 6 really interesting.
It hangs in the balance.
It hangs in the balance, but it also is bright in that, although there are so many opportunities in which this show could go, all the books presented between the past 2 episodes are very strong. So I'm excited, man. Lots of really exciting reading to be done in the near future. But we also have to determine the reading order too. We need to figure out, once we pick the 2 books, which one are we going to read first? And I don't know.
It can be a vote on Twitter,
it can
probably.
be a vote on Twitter. Why not? So just yet another reason to check out social media. So
we used to do the epic on-air audio only coin flip back in the day when we were just starting out and we probably didn't have enough followers to actually create a vote on Twitter that would get enough feedback. So yeah, those were desperate times. They called for desperate measures. I don't know, maybe we do bring the coin flip back though, Charles.
Maybe we bring people liked the coin flip back in the day.
The on-air coin flip.
Although now that we might be showing video, maybe we could show something, but I don't know. I don't know if we're that fancy. But
no.
We'll see. There's a lot left to decide, and only the future will tell. So be sure to check us out on social and look out for that next podcast upload to see where the heck all of this ends up, because as of right now it is very much unknown. But the one thing that I do know is that there's nothing left for us now but to play that sweet, sweet outro music. What do you say, Dylan?
I say get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping, Charles.
All right, let's do it. Thank you, everyone, one and all, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, let us know over on the socials at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end on Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they supported the show on social media, but they want to support us even more, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast. You can now do that on Spotify. It's just 2 clicks to make that happen over at the top of our Spotify page for Friends Talking Fantasy. And it helps us so much when you do that. We're just out here doing this for the love of the game. And we're not making any money off of this, folks. We're just here to try to spread the word and love about these awesome books. You can also give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. We appreciate that so much, too. We'll be coming at you with probably another episode in a couple days to announce which ones we picked for these FPF episodes. Anyway, right now, I just want to say just listening is more than enough. You don't have to do any of those ratings and reviews. We just love that you're out there enjoying our content.
Well said, Dylan. Just listening is already so much. And thank you so much for doing that, making it all the way to this episode. We greatly appreciate it. You guys are awesome. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.